You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than, how dare you? That question would have to be, Mark, the Konica Lexio 70 is a high-spec, compact 35mm film point-and-shoot with a wide and moderately bright 28mm f3.4 lens. Surely it's got to be one of the best in class, doesn't it? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question. The Konica Lexio 70 is an advanced compact film point-and-shoot camera from the year 2000 that arrived just at the time when the world was starting to buy digital cameras, but the boast was still that film could produce higher resolution and dynamic range than any digital sensor. Certainly true for 2000, less true for now. But hey, however you look at it, this is a full-frame camera that's not much bigger than a deck of cards and one of the few point-and-shoots that's genuinely small enough to fit in the pocket of your jeans. It represents the last tide in a sea of cheap point-and-shoot cameras with not much to distinguish one over the other. But you have to acknowledge that this one is a bit different. Not only is it small, but it's wide, giving you 28mm when zoomed out. Zooming in is less impressive, peaking at a paltry 70mm, but hey, it's a point and shoot. They probably kept the zoom range small to ensure a fast wide aperture and stellar image quality throughout the zoom range, right? Well, that might be true of my Contax TVS, but my Contax TVS is now broken, so it's a moot point, and I'm not sure that it's true of this camera. Firstly, by the time you zoom into 70mm, that f3.4 aperture shrinks to a much more modest f7.9, which doesn't sound too bad until you think 70mm isn't exactly telephoto, and that's the maximum aperture you're going to get for your zoomed in portraits. So don't expect too much of a blurry background here. But look at it. It's small, it's metal, and it's highly advanced. It's really quite a slick camera, maybe ideal as a pocketable film travel companion. Well, that's what I've been thinking. I've got to go to China for a month to work, and perhaps this is the one that I should take with me, or not. Let's take it out for a run, this time to Subiaco. No, not the Italian town, just a dog walk through the Western Australian suburb, named by the Benedictine missionaries that came here to make olive oil and teach shame to the heathen masses. So how about I try and capture these dudes in a way that's a bit different. Maybe face on first. How about them? Let's try and get some fern fronds. What about that huge leaf? Is there an abstract photo to be had there? That's about as close as I can get. This way? Yes. Yes, perhaps. Vertically. The mode to flash off. Autofocus seems to have picked infinity, which is probably fair enough for a camera like this. wildlife photographer with a point and shoot. Let's try and capture some of these bin chickens. Alright, gonna go 1.5. That was a blooming good time. Two things learnt from that outing. Firstly, I really should have checked the lens on my GoPro for smears after handling. And secondly, either the Kentmere 100 seems to have cheapened out on the anti-halation layer, or there's a definite bloom to some of the highlights on the lens on this thing. So who needs a black Pro Mist filter to mitigate that overly sharpened GoPro footage when you've got your own sweaty and sunscreen lathered fingers to apply that professional glow? But enough of my poor handling hygiene, let's talk about the Konica Lexio 70. While some point and shoots managed to garner a huge reputation over the years, perhaps not 100% deservedly, and yes, I'm looking at you, Olympus Mewtwo, you won't find the online photo community raving about this camera. Part of that was undoubtedly a result of it flying under the radar, coming in late to the game to a crowded market. But I do think too that there are no real compelling attributes about this camera that make it shine beyond the 28mm lens. Yes, it's wide, and that's definitely useful. As mediocre as this shot is, and yes, that's the auto flash reflecting hideously off the brass of the statue, at least I was able to fit the scene in, which wouldn't have been possible with most of the other alternative cameras that I've got. And I do love the size, which is the second thing that's drawing me to it. Finally, It's a good electronic camera, by which I mean that it's thoughtfully laid out with a single mode button that allows you to scroll through the settings, and it has a good top-mounted and backlit LCD that's easy to read. You get a good level of information in the viewfinder too, showing focus and flash information with a clear green LED. But clever doesn't necessarily mean competent, given how you relinquish so much control to the inscrutable juju of the camera's exposure and focus settings. In the end, it just comes down to the results. And how does it fare? Well, actually pretty good on the whole. Firstly, the obligatory caveat. These are not curated photos. If you've watched this channel before, you'll know by now that what you get is the full roll warts and all, with all of those foibles and frailties that infect both the equipment, the subject matter, and mostly me as the arbiter of it all. Still, when I look at photos like this, I can't complain. The lens can be sharp for the most part. I love the detail in the fern fronds. I'm not sure that sharpness in the center is replicated consistently throughout the frame though, and there's nothing particularly attractive about the out of focus areas. But then, isn't that true of most point and shoots? While I'm not a fan of flash normally, I did pop some light into a couple of the scenes for a point of comparison, sometimes even deliberately. And as you can see with this example, it did give a bit of fill without overpowering the scene, though still looking a bit flashy, if you know what I mean. In the end, it's a point and shoot, and I know not to set my standards too high, and it was certainly serviceable. But really, how can you judge the quality of something without some kind of benchmark? So for that, I dug out my Canon Sure Shot Classic 120. This is probably my go-to point and shoot in terms of balancing those qualities that make these cameras convenient without producing consistently hideous results. What I did was load 12 exposures into bulk cassettes for both the Konica Lexio 70 and the Canon Sure Shot Classic 120. I tried to take the same photo, stopping at a few locations on my drive home, and then developing them in the same tank with the same chemistry, in this case microfilm stock solution, and scanned at the same settings, initially quite flat, and then applying the same sharpening and toning to all of the photos to try and keep the results moderately consistent. Look, I didn't control for all of the variables, and I'm the most variable of all those variables anyway, so don't expect any objectivity here, but I have formed some conclusions. The first thing to do was to test the telephoto on this thing, obviously only at around 70mm, and I mean around, because you'll see that it was almost impossible to completely replicate the field of view. That's partly because of the imprecision of the zoom mechanism. I'm not sure if the Canon is actually stepless, but the Konica definitely ends up landing on a few fixed zoom positions. Focused to infinity and zoomed in, there really isn't much to say about either of these cameras. Konica on the left, Canon on the right. The results are fine, but not much to distinguish them. Definitely not going to make a call on sharpness based on the different fields of view. The Canon is clearly more zoomed in, and while there does seem to be some better sharpness in the foliage, once you start to look at the distant buildings, there isn't much that you can attribute to the camera itself. The church and spires are definitely more exposed in the Konica, and I think that it's consistent across most of the images, and perhaps most importantly, a bit lower in contrast too. Not a great sign, though I can dig a low contrast lens sometimes if I'm going for a more vintage look. Speaking of vintage, I find myself driving past my dad's old workplace when we moved to Australia in 1983. I actually painted that white brick retaining wall for pocket money, and it looks like it hasn't been done since. But I digress. What about the photo? Well, at first glance, they both look pretty sharp. The Canon is actually a tiny bit more zoomed out, but close enough, I think, to draw some conclusions. The fact that you can't read the sign clearly is probably as much to do with the 400 speed film than the camera lenses. In both cases, you can clearly see the number 348, and maybe it's just a bit cleaner in the Konica, so good job to both, at least with regard to center sharpness. It's only when you start to get closer to the corners that things get a little bit different. At the far right, there isn't much to choose between them, but if you look at the chimney pot here, then the Canon is definitely a bit sharper, I think. I'd go so far as to say that there's a bit of ghosting in the Konica. If you look at the veranda post, then there's definitely a big difference. The Canon is clearly sharper, and if you look at the bottom left of the image too, there's a little bit more detail in the pavement cracks. Another rustic Federation style home and a rusty letterbox. Compare the two and you'll see both my dodgy framing and that the Konica is definitely exposing the picture a bit more than the Canon. And I think it's to the detriment here because firstly, if you just compare the photos side by side, the Canon is more punchy, but if you look at some of the white painted wood too, there's a clear level of detail on the Canon that you just don't see on the Konica. I don't think that's recoverable either. It's just gone here. If you look at the air conditioning unit, there just isn't much there anymore. Interesting too that it's in the same point in the lens as the softness around the chimney stacks on the other photo. But if you move to the other edge of the photo, it's pretty much the same story. Foliage is quite jittery on the Konica, whereas it holds up a bit better on the Canon. In the center and in the darker areas of the image, there's much less difference, and arguably the higher exposure gives us a bit more shadow detail to play with in the overexposed image. Closing in on that rusty letterbox, and again the Konica's holding up well. There's definitely some bite to the lens. I'm just a bit worried about how it works over the whole frame. Close up and wide, and you do see some differences. The first thing you'll notice is that there's what looks like quite severe pin cushioning in the Canon, though that could just be the fence. The Konica doesn't seem to suffer it, or it's just a slightly different perspective giving slightly different results. You do get to see how the cameras handle the out of focus areas in these pictures. And what's pleasing is that both seem to manage to scoop a dollop of creamy bokeh out of the backgrounds. But the foreground is quite different. Now, the fastest the Canon gets at 38mm is f4.5, so you should expect narrower depth of field from the f3.4 Konica, assuming that's what the camera shot at. But you never know with any point and shoot. I'm going to assume that the foreground timber post is a bit out of focus on the Konica, but regardless, it's pretty clear that the transition is not too pleasing. The wood just doesn't look soft. It looks ghosty and nervous and just plain ugly, honestly. The same for the fence, which looks a bit hard and fringy rather than soft as it falls away into the distance. Onto a disused car lot to take a picture through the fence. Again, the Canon is a bit more zoomed in and again seems a bit more punchy. Perhaps because of the slightly different exposure, but overall it's just a more crunchy image, I think. Looking at the darker areas too, there's still plenty of detail and the numbers are definitely crisper here, albeit a bit bigger too. Clear win to the Canon here, I think, and just on the basis of contrast, if nothing else. Straight on from the middle distance onto a house front, and this is probably a good test of distortion. The Canon pin cushioning is evident here, and at first glance the Konica looks a bit better, but I just think the Canon has stronger and more regular distortion, while the Konica just seems a little bit less easy to define. I think both are correctable, but it was a bit easier with the Canon. Just straighten and apply -10 to the distortion slider, whereas I did have to fiddle a bit with the transform panel in Lightroom for the Konica. What was noticeable here though was just how much softer the Konica is compared to the Canon. The chipboard here particularly shows the Canon was better able to capture the textures of the wood, and there's much more detail in the electricity panel. If this was the first example, I'd probably chalk it up to user error with focus or camera shake, but I don't know, the center bolt in the awning is equally sharp in both. I think I'm starting to see a pattern. Another brick wall, and the story is kind of the same. The image from the Konica is pleasing enough until you start to compare it to the Canon. Again, the center is sharp enough, but again, as you move out to the edge, you start to lose the texture in the concrete and the Konica, while the Canon proves to be a bit sharper and a bit more contrasty, even given the slight difference in exposure. And I'm not sure what the Konica has against foliage, but we're also seeing that jitteriness in the left corner too. It's like as soon as you move out of critical focus or to the corners, everything remotely busy just looks like a mess. To labour the point, another brick wall, this time face on, and we have the same story. The Konica is brighter, sharp enough in the middle, but a bit softer around the edges. I tried to edit this one to bring the exposures as close as I could, but even then there just isn't the same level of detail and clarity here. Looking at some of the paint drips, you can clearly see ghosting. Is that camera shake? Maybe, but remember the Konica has a slightly wider aperture than the Canon. One final image of a lamppost, just to see how the Konica handles backlighting compared to the Canon. And for the first time, the Konica looks a bit underexposed here. It certainly does a better job with the sky, but I think if I were to try and shoot a backlit subject on auto without flash, the Canon might be a bit better straight out of the box. To be fair, the Konica does have manual backlight compensation, but then the Canon has a whole bunch of different modes, including spot metering, as well as sport and portrait options. So, what have we learnt from this exercise? Not much, let's be honest, we're splitting grains here. And look, at an initial pass, the Konica Lexio 70 holds up really well. It does have a few downsides, particularly when compared to the Canon Sure Shot Classic 120 though. So let's sum up the pros and cons. Firstly, the pros. You get metal construction, and while it does feel a bit flimsy, that's inevitable given the other huge pro of this camera, size and weight. Yes, this thing is tiny and one of the smallest 35mm cameras I own. For that reason on its own, it's going to be an attractive proposition as a travel camera. It's also quite easy to start up one-handed. I like sliding doors on cameras like this, they're just really convenient. It's also quite straightforward to use with one mode button that you only have to press once when you start it to return to the last flash state of the camera, which is kind of a clever compromise between automatically resetting the camera for noobs while allowing a seasoned professional to quickly turn the flash off, or an unseasoned amateur like me to completely forget. It's got a beautiful backlit LCD that's much more readable than many other cameras of its class, and that's reinforced by an equally sophisticated viewfinder that provides parallax correction and a clear LED display that shows when you're in focus and if you're focused macro or at infinity. It doesn't seem like much, but it's a notch above the typical green or red flash you get in your periphery of your vision with most point-and-shoots. It's a classy feature. It also has a diopter control, which is useful for the optically challenged. And of course, finally, you get that other rarity, a 28mm lens at the wide end, which is true wide angle and much better than the standard 35 or 38mm you get on most point and shoots. The downsides, well, that zoom maxes out at 70mm, which is just a bit short for me. The limited step zoom was a bit of a frustration when taking these comparison shots too. It's not something I've ever really noticed in the real world, but it seems quite a retrograde feature for such an advanced camera. And here's something weird. The lens zooms in a bit when you take the picture. Does it affect the shot? No, but it's visible in the viewfinder, so a bit disconcerting until you get used to it. While the one mode button is great on the one hand, it does mean that you have to press it several times occasionally to get to a particular setting. This isn't an overcomplicated camera though, so there aren't too many of them, and uncommon settings like date, remote and self-timer are hidden behind this recessed fingernail button. Finally, image quality, and I don't know. I feel tempted to put it in the positives because the lens can be sharp sometimes, particularly at the center. But as you could see with the comparison, the Canon was a lot more consistent, and at times the Konica exhibited softness at the corners or even within other parts of the frame, and some of the focus transition areas are jittery to say the least. This camera can be sharp and soft. regular and distorted, and you just don't really know when or why. It's just inconsistent. And that's why I think, Konica, I'm not going to take you with me to China. And it's for a few reasons. The first is in the name, Sure Shot 120. In nearly all cases, my preference in a street camera is for wider rather than telephoto. But 70mm is a bit short. You know, maybe I'm prepared to sacrifice that 28 for 38 if it means I get some 120 at the long end. But I guess that's not a compelling reason on its own, more just a commentary on the inevitable compromises of both cameras. Look, if this was something that I was going to be taking out to parties to shoot snaps of friends as we hang out drinking bubble tea, then maybe the Konica would be the most pocketable and best solution. But I don't have friends and I don't drink bubble tea. More than likely, I'll be wandering on my own, wanting to capture the grandeur of Shanghai suburbia, and then image quality is more important than fun and convenience, and really the Canon just stands out as that bit more contrasty, that bit more sharp, that bit more consistent, and that bit more powerful. To be fair, I don't think this video has really shown the potential of either of these cameras. We haven't even shot any color film. And as both Paul Simon and my wife will tell me, everything does look worse in black and white. Mama, don't take my coat, go away. Yeah. The Konica has had some color film in it in the past, and it's held up well for the most part, producing some fantastic shots along with some less fantastic ones that really do point to some of the limitations we've spoken about today. The Canon Sure Shot 120 is just a bit more consistent. It's not as small as the Konica, but it's not big either, and it has its own unique qualities that we haven't really explored yet. In fact, you could probably spend a whole video just putting the Canon through its paces, which actually sounds like a good idea. Let me know if you want me to share my holiday snaps from China when I return, and I'll try to oblige. Hey, if anyone wants to send me some color film, maybe I'll even give it the Wizard of Oz treatment and escape the Zack Snyder director's cut we seem to have found ourselves in since the price of color film has shot up higher than a Willie Nelson jam session. So, like, subscribe, comment, ring that notification bell, and I will return with the results later.